It had been a long day. Megan drove up the winding road, feeling tired but also excited. This new house was her dream, a fresh start. She had always wanted to live in the country, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Pine Hill, with its quiet streets and ancient trees, was the perfect place to settle. The house came up ahead, looming over the road. It was old, yes, but beautiful in its way. 3 stories with tall windows and a wide porch. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, except for the way the trees around it seemed to bend unnaturally, as if they were watching her. Megan shook the thought out of her mind. "It's just an old house," she muttered to herself. She pulled into the driveway and stopped the car. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. As she stepped out of the car, she looked up at the house, her new home. For a moment, she felt a strange chill pass through her. But she shrugged it off. New places always had their quirks. The first thing Megan noticed when she stepped inside was the silence. It was as if the house had swallowed up all the sounds. No creaks, no murmurs of wind, just a deep, unnatural quiet. The living room was spacious, filled with antique furniture covered in dust. Old portraits lined the walls, their eyes following her as she moved. Megan shuddered. "Maybe I'll just unpack tomorrow," she thought. She picked up her bags and moved toward the staircase. The stairs creaked under her weight, each step a protest against her movement. The air smelled like old wood and forgotten things. The house, despite its beauty, felt abandoned. Something wasn't quite right, but Megan couldn't place it. Her eyes darted to the windows. Night had already begun to fall, casting long shadows over the rooms. She shook her head and smiled to herself. Stop being paranoid, she told herself. After all, it was just an old house, nothing more. The hallway on the second floor was long, and the rooms seemed distant. But there was a door at the end, half open. Curiosity pulled her in. She walked down the corridor, the faint sound of her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she neared the door, she noticed a chill in the air. It was colder here than anywhere else in the house, like an invisible draft. Megan hesitated, but then stepped forward. The door creaked open, and she stepped into the room. It was a bedroom. The bed was large, its frame wooden and intricately carved. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and dust motes swirled in the shafts of fading light. A single window looked out into the yard, where the trees loomed like dark sentinels. She stepped closer to the bed and noticed something strange. A small piece of paper was stuck under the edge of the mattress. Megan frowned and reached for it, pulling it out. On the paper was a single word written in shaky handwriting, "Leave." Her heart skipped a beat. A sense of dread washed over her, but she shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just the ramblings of a previous owner. But then she noticed something that sent a jolt through her. On the floor, under the bed, were faint marks, like scratches. They were shallow but deep enough to make her uncomfortable. Megan turned to leave, but as she did, the temperature in the room dropped even more. She felt like she was being watched. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a faint whisper, almost like a sigh. "Megan." Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been when she entered. But that voice, who said that? With her breath catching in her throat, she backed toward the door. Her eyes were wild now, searching every corner of the room. She could feel the weight of something old and angry, something that had been waiting. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. She screamed, and the air thickened, as if the house was alive with something dark and malevolent. Megan banged against the door, trying to escape, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling the room around her, echoing in the air. The voice wasn't alone anymore. There were others, many voices coming from every direction. They weren't all speaking at once, just one by one, repeating the same thing over and over. "Leave, leave, leave." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The house itself seemed to groan in protest, its foundation shaking. Dust fell from the ceiling. A cold draft swirled in the air, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. "Help! Somebody, help! Megan screamed, but there was no answer. No one could hear her. She was alone. The voices grew louder, louder than before. Megan pressed her hands to her ears, desperate to block them out, but it didn't help. They still rang in her head, a chorus of whispering voices that clawed at her mind. Leave, leave. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed her shoulder, freezing her to the bone. She spun around, eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. The voices grew insistent now, as if pushing her, urging her, wanting her to leave before it was too late. Then the room started to change. The walls shifted, stretching and distorting, like the house was twisting and warping before her very eyes. The light flickered, casting strange, grotesque shadows in every corner. The floorboards groaned beneath her, as if something beneath the house was moving. Something alive. A sudden sharp sound rang out, the screeching of metal against stone. Megan spun around, her eyes darting wildly. In the corner of the room, something moved. A shadow detached itself from the rest of the darkness and crawled across the floor toward her. It was like a creature from her darkest nightmares, not quite human, but almost. Thin, bony hands reached out from the shadow, scrabbling on the floor as if the floor itself was trying to hold it back. The air grew colder, freezing her limbs, making it harder to move. Get out! A crash rang out from downstairs. Megan barely had time to register the sound before the room plunged into total darkness, save for the dim, flickering light from the hallway. With trembling hands, Megan pulled at the door again, but it refused to open. Despair surged within her. Her eyes darted back to the dark corner of the room, where the shadow still crawled closer. Its whispering voice joined the chorus, and it called her name, Megan. She couldn't breathe. Sweat poured from her forehead as she backed away, stumbling over the wrecked furniture. Desperately, she made for the stairs, each step sending painful groans through the house. The whispers followed her, never ceasing, growing louder with every... Finally, Megan reached the top of the stairs. She glanced back just as the door swung open. The figure from the corner now stood in the hallway, its face a hideous blur of sharp features and malice. Eyes without pupils gleamed in the shadowed room. Without thinking, Megan bolted down the hallway, sprinting toward the stairwell. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she raced down the steps, but before she reached the bottom, something grabbed her ankle. She yelped as she was yanked back up toward the shadows above. The whispers in her ear grew deafening now. "Leave this place. Leave before it takes you." Megan screamed, her heart hammering against her ribs as her body was lifted back toward the stairs, unable to escape. With a desperate tug, she finally broke free of whatever had a hold on her, and she slammed her body against the basement door at the end of the hall. Without a thought, Megan yanked it open, plunging into the darkened basement. The door slammed shut behind her as she slid to the floor, gasping for air, but the voices didn't stop. They were still with her. Her eyes flitted to every corner, her pulse rising. The cold was suffocating. The scent of damp earth, old wood, and mildew filled her lungs. She could barely see her own hands as she reached for something, anything to hold on to. Suddenly, she spotted something near the wall that might give her an answer. There, tucked behind a pile of boxes, was an old wooden chest. Marks on it. Long, deep gouges ran along the surface, almost like someone had been trying to claw their way out. Her heartbeat quickened at the thought, but Megan knew she had no other choice. There was something wrong with the house, and if it was her only chance to escape, she had to find out what. With trembling hands, she approached the chest. Her fingers slid over the worn wood, and for a moment, the house seemed to fall silent. Then, with a creaking sound that sent a shiver down her spine, the chest began to open by itself, as if beckoning her. The moment it was fully ajar, the basement temperature dropped even further, an icy blast rushing over her skin. And there it was, a journal, bound in cracked leather. She reached for it and, trembling, opened to the first page. "House of the Damned" was scrawled in uneven, jagged handwriting. Megan flipped through the pages quickly, feeling the weight of the dark secrets inside each written word. The journal described the house in eerie detail, but what chilled her more than anything else was the final sentence. It seeks the one who remains. Once the last resident arrives, it will not let you leave. Her blood turned cold. She had just moved into the house, and it was clear now. It was not a coincidence. It had been waiting for her. The next voice she heard was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. Loud, painful, tortured. A woman, shrieking in agony, pleading for release. The walls around Megan seemed to groan, and the air in the basement felt thick with the ancient, oppressive force she now realized the house harbored. It wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Terror took hold of her. She had to get out. Megan's hands shook as she clutched the journal, the last entry searing into her mind. The realization sank in like a stone lodged in her chest. She wasn't meant to live here. The house had already marked her, and she could feel its presence, closing in on her with every passing second. A cold wind began to blow through the basement, despite there being no windows or ventilation. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. She snapped the journal shut and shoved it into her bag, trying not to panic. It was now clear what she was dealing with. A house that consumed the souls of its inhabitants, luring them in and trapping them forever. But what was this entity that ruled Pine Hill? Her thoughts were interrupted by a creak, the unmistakable sound of the stairs above her groaning under weight. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just the house groaning, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like something moving upstairs, tracking her every move. The footsteps halted, and then a voice, not one of the whispers this time, but a single clear word. Megan. She jolted, terror flooding her body. That voice again, the same voice from before, the same low, hollow tone that called her name. Megan, you cannot leave. She scrambled for the basement stairs, panic rising like bile in her throat. Her legs, weak from fear, trembled under her. She had to escape. The front door. The front door was the only way out, if she could just reach it. Megan reached for the basement door, but before her hand could touch the knob, the house seemed to move, to shift. She felt the temperature plummet further, and the floorboards around her began to creak louder, more urgently, as if something was coming from within the very walls of the house, crawling toward her. Something was closing in on her. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out completely. Darkness enveloped her, swallowing everything whole. She wasn't alone. A muffled scraping sound filled the silence, like claws dragging across the floor. A quiet gasp of breath reached her ears, wet, painful, desperate. Megan turned back toward the basement. In the pitch darkness, she could barely see, but as her eyes adjusted, a faint, unnerving figure began to take form. Something hunched low to the ground. A figure, barely human, its twisted limbs stretched in unnatural angles, began to crawl toward her with a sort of slow, deliberate slowness. Its eyes glowed dimly, devoid of any warmth or humanity. Instead, they were a pale, sickly yellow, glazed over, and filled with the promise of something ancient and vengeful. She took a step back, her heart racing. The creature wasn't moving like an animal. No, it seemed to sense her, waiting for the right moment, watching her with malevolent patience. "Leave," the voice hissed again, now all around her. The house was alive. The creature that had come to claim her was no longer something in the corner of her mind. It was real, and it was hungry. Without thinking, Megan bolted for the stairs. As she took the first step up, the screeching of the creature's claws echoed in her ears. It was gaining on her, moving faster than before, its twisted form gliding across the darkened basement with frightening speed. Megan pushed herself, leaping the rest of the stairs two at a time, hearing the scraping sound echoing, the scrape of its claws against the wooden floors in the basement below. She slammed the basement door shut behind her and threw her weight against it. For a moment it held, but there was no time to think about it. Panic was filling her veins like fire. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. The scream of the creature tore through the darkness again, sending chills down her spine. Megan raced down the hallway and reached the front door. Her hand trembled as she turned the knob. Nothing. She screamed and pulled at the door harder. It wouldn't open. A gut-wrenching cackle echoed through the house. From somewhere deep inside, it sounded like someone was mocking her, enjoying her helplessness. Despair flooded over her. She slammed her fist against the door as if her strength could will it open. "No!" she cried. "I need to get out." In that moment, a sudden realization struck her. The house. It wasn't just a place, it had a purpose. It existed to trap the living and claim their souls, and it would never release anyone without a fight. With a last breath of frantic energy, Megan threw herself against the door one more time, and this time, it budged. For a brief moment, she could see the faintest sliver of moonlight outside, the night sky like a ribbon of freedom just beyond her grasp. But before she could escape, a harsh force slammed into her back. It felt like being hit by a wave of cold air mixed with something much worse, a palpable, suffocating presence, as if the house itself had reached out with clawed hands. She was yanked backward toward the dark hallway, back into the very heart of the house that meant to keep her. "You're mine," the voice whispered, sending shivers through her. And then, the door slammed shut. In a flash, the house grew eerily still again. There was no sound, no sign of the creature, just the silence, the deep, unsettling silence of a house that knew its time had come. But Megan felt the weight of it in every breath. She was no longer alone, and now there was nowhere to run. Nothing but the house and its hunger, the thing that had been waiting. Megan stood frozen in the center of the hallway, unable to move. The air had thickened with the same oppressive presence she had felt when she first stepped into the house. The silence now felt like a heavy weight pressing in from all sides, drowning her in isolation. She could hear the beating of her own heart, thumping wildly against her ribs, but nothing else. It was as though the house had swallowed everything. The whispering voices had faded, for the moment, but she knew they were still there, waiting. "Leave." The word echoed inside her head. She gripped the edge of the hallway table in front of her, her knuckles turning white from the strain. She had to leave. The house, whatever it was, wouldn't let her go. But how? She had tried everything. The windows were sealed tight. The doors wouldn't budge. The walls felt as if they were breathing, shifting, closing in around her. The creature was out there somewhere, lurking. She couldn't even be sure where it had gone. The whole house felt like a trap now, a spider's web that had closed around her, and the more she struggled, the more impossible it became to escape. Suddenly, the house groaned again. It wasn't a subtle creak this time, but a deep, resonating sound, like the moan of an old, tired beast. Megan shuddered, her instincts screaming at her to run. But where could she run? Her eyes darted back to the staircase. The silence was broken by a soft, shuffling sound, followed by the faintest rasp of breath. She turned sharply, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the darkness of the upper landing. Just a glimpse, a flicker of movement, before it vanished. "It's coming." Her thoughts scattered. She couldn't stay. She needed to find something, anything that would let her break out. Maybe there was a cellar, a trap door, something hidden she hadn't found yet. Megan turned toward the kitchen at the far end of the hallway, but before she could take a step forward, a piercing shriek split the air. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was a sound too dreadful to comprehend, a high-pitched screech that clawed at her sanity. Her legs froze in place. Please, not now. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the sound ceased. Megan could feel it. Something was watching her from above. Her eyes locked onto the top of the stairs, her breath shallow and quick. The whole house seemed to have come alive again, shuddering, quaking with anticipation. She knew the creature, or whatever it was waiting, almost savoring her fear. With no other choice, she bolted down the hallway toward the kitchen, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty house. She reached the door and threw it open, stumbling inside, her body reacting faster than her mind. Inside, the space was cramped, cluttered with old kitchenware and long-forgotten objects. A set of cabinets stood on the far wall, covered with dust, their wood aging and brittle. But at the back, one of the cabinets looked slightly different from the rest. Megan's pulse surged as she walked toward it. A sense of urgency pushed her forward. She had to find something to defend herself, or at least a way out. Her hand gripped the cabinet handle, and she pulled it open with all her strength. A large metal object clattered to the floor, causing her to jump back in fright. But what she found wasn't much of a weapon at all. An old, rusted fireplace poker. It would do nothing against whatever lived in this house, but it gave her something to hold, something that would help her feel a little less powerless. But as her fingers gripped the rusted metal, a shadow passed by the doorway, too fast for her to truly catch, but its presence undeniable. Megan's blood ran cold. It was close. The shadow materialized into something more tangible just outside the kitchen, and she finally saw it. The creature, its grotesque, distorted body filled the narrow hallway. It slithered, too many limbs contorting in the most unnatural ways. And its face. It was as if parts of it were human, and other parts were lost in the twisted confusion of nightmares. It didn't have eyes, just hollows that seemed to pull the light out of the room. "Megan." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a distorted chant, a low, hollow sound that seemed to ripple through the air. She lunged toward the window, but as she pulled the curtains apart to try and see outside, it was as though the darkness itself swallowed any hint of the night sky. It was impossible to see. There was no escape. Desperation clawed at her. She turned back to the creature as it inched closer, the floor creaking with its unnatural weight. The walls seemed to close in, the house twisting again, as if it were alive, pulling her deeper into its terrible grip. Without thinking, Megan swung the fireplace poker at it, her hand trembling with fear. But the moment it made contact, the creature shrieked in pain. It sounded like broken glass scraping against stone, like an agony that could tear apart the very fabric of the world. But the creature didn't stop. It didn't retreat. It seemed only to become angrier. "Leave me alone," Megan screamed, her voice raw from terror. Suddenly, the lights above flickered, casting terrifying shadows on the walls. And in that instant, everything went silent. Then came the voices. They were all around her. Hundreds, thousands. Megan froze. She could no longer distinguish between them. She couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. Their words were distorted, overlapping with such intensity that they became one endless scream, rising in crescendo. Her eyes locked on the open doorway across from her, leading deeper into the house. It was almost like something was calling her forward, compelling her to move closer, despite her every instinct screaming against it. If you want to survive, go deeper. She had no choice. Gritting her teeth, she stepped forward, leaving the kitchen behind. The house groaned in approval. Megan's feet moved like stone, unwilling but compelled by the force of the house pulling her forward. The hall stretched on before her, darker and colder with each step. The whispering grew more urgent, more desperate. "Come, find you us. We have waited so long." Her pulse raced, each echo a blow to her sanity. She could barely comprehend the words, but she could feel them. A tangible presence clawing at her mind. Something old, ancient, calling from deep within the house. The house was a prison, and its prisoner was now the one who must join the ranks of those trapped inside. At the end of the hallway, the door to the room where everything had begun stood open. The creature was gone, but it didn't matter anymore. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to beckon her, pulling her in as though the very fabric of the house wanted to consume her. She stood still for a moment, not sure if she could move further. The house felt like it was waiting for her, watching her every move with an omnipotent eye. The air, thick and stale, pressed against her skin like an iron weight. But she had come this far. There was no turning back. The whispers were too loud now, vibrating within her very bones. They had never ceased, just gotten quieter when the creature was near. It was a pressure, an unbearable pull that was leading her toward the epicenter of this madness. She took a step. The door groaned and creaked as she entered. Inside, there was a heavy darkness. The smell of mold and rot clung to everything. The walls, the furniture, even the air itself. It wasn't just a room, it was a tomb. A holding place for whatever cursed spirits had been taken long before her, and now they were waiting for her. But now she saw it. In the center of the room, something was different. A vast circular symbol had been carved into the wooden floor. It was intricate, strange, almost hypnotic. The design seemed to move, swirling and twisting under her gaze as though they were alive, crawling across the wood like snakes, urging her closer. As if in a trance, Megan walked into the center of the symbol. Her body seemed to respond before her mind, urging her down. She knelt, and a voice, cold and ancient, filled the room. "You were chosen. You are one of us now." With that final sentence, the light above her flickered once more. Her body froze as she felt something sharp, something unearthly tug at her soul. It was as if the house itself was siphoning the last pieces of her being, claiming her for its own. In that moment, the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. For a long, unending time, everything was dark. The whispers ceased, leaving only silence. And then Megan opened her eyes. But she wasn't in the room anymore. She was standing somewhere else, somewhere cold and unwelcoming, but familiar. It was a dark hallway, another endless corridor stretching in both directions. Her heart twisted with horror. She understood now. She had become part of the house, part of the story that repeated itself over and over, each new resident becoming a whisper, a soul drawn into its vast darkness, serving whatever force lay behind it. She could hear their voices now, faint at first, then louder. Leave this place. But it was no use. She would never leave, and the house would never let her go. It had been weeks since I had moved into the new house, yet every night I felt the same cold dread creep into my bones. The house, an old stone structure sitting on the edge of the forest, was far more isolated than I had imagined when I first saw it. Sure, it seemed perfect when I first moved in, spacious, quiet, and full of charm. But there was something about it, something that made me uneasy. The house had been empty for many years, the real estate agent had said, as if that should reassure me. But there was no denying that the house carried the weight of its age. It creaked in places, its floors uneven, the windows warped. But still, I had believed in the idea of a fresh start. This would be my sanctuary. Little did I know how wrong I was. I had no neighbors for miles around, and the only company I had were the towering trees that seemed to surround the house on all sides. At night, the wind would howl through the branches, and I would often hear strange rustlings in the woods, like someone, or something, moving just outside the range of my vision. But it was one evening, as the golden light of the sun faded into dusk, that I first saw it. I was sitting at my kitchen table, writing a few notes, when a strange chill filled the room. I looked out of the window into the dense forest that stretched beyond the yard. It was then I saw a figure, a shadow darting between the trees. It was no more than a fleeting movement, but it caught my attention. Thinking it might just be an animal, or perhaps a trick of the light, I tried to brush it off. But as the days went by, the shadow became more distinct. It wasn't a person, it wasn't a creature. It seemed to be something else, something that was impossible to define. That night, I heard footsteps in the attic, loud, slow, deliberate. I had no reason to think it could be an animal. This was a house built to last, and nothing could move in the attic without my knowledge. I had to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs. The attic door creaked as I pulled it open, and the air inside felt thicker, heavier, as if something ancient lingered in the dark. My flashlight flicked across the bare wood beams above me, but there was nothing. I turned slowly, scanning every corner. It was only then I noticed the old wooden chest tucked in a corner, which I had never seen before. It was strange. Why hadn't I noticed it when I moved in? I didn't recall ever seeing it. I stepped closer and reached for the chest, hesitating for only a moment before I opened it. Inside there were old newspapers and faded photographs, nothing unusual for an abandoned house. But underneath the papers, I found something that made my stomach turn. A small, dusty book, bound in cracked leather. It looked far older than anything else in the chest. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were covered in handwritten symbols and notes, scribbled with a frantic energy that made my skin crawl. As I flipped through the book, a sense of dread filled the air. The shadows around me seemed to deepen, and I could hear something scratching at the walls. Suddenly, the house seemed to groan, as if alive, its walls pulsing with some unseen energy. My flashlight flickered, and I quickly shut the book, slamming it down on the chest. For a moment, everything felt still, as if time had frozen. I made my way back downstairs, heart racing, but the feeling of being watched never left me. It stayed with me that night and every night thereafter. Days passed, but the unease only deepened. In the silence of the house, I would hear whispers, always faint, just on the edge of my hearing. Sometimes they came from the attic, sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes right beside my ear as I lay in bed. It was the strange noise that alerted me to the presence of something even worse. One evening, I was in the living room reading. The house was quiet, and a feeling of dread had hung in the air all day. The wind howled outside, and I tried to ignore the feeling that something or someone was in the house. I stood up, deciding to check the doors and windows. As I walked toward the front door, I froze. From the way that led into the kitchen, I saw something. There, standing just out of view, was a pale figure. Its features were indistinct, and the moment I looked at it, it faded into the darkness. My heartbeat increased, and I quickly backed away, eyes darting around the room. What was it? Who was it? I decided to call a friend the next day, asking if they could come over to the house. I wasn't ready to admit that I was afraid, but I also didn't want to face whatever haunted this place alone. The next day, a friend named Sarah came over, noticing how unsettled I was. She offered to help with whatever I needed, but I had not yet told her the full extent of what had been happening in the house. I showed her the strange chest in the attic, the old book with its terrifying symbols, and confessed to hearing footsteps, whispers, and even seeing the mysterious figure. She didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she grew concerned, suggesting that we might need to look deeper into the history of the house. We both researched, and through a dusty old journal we found in town, we uncovered something chilling. The house had once been the home of an eccentric man, Elias Whitmore, who had a reputation for dabbling in occult practices. He believed the forest that surrounded the house had a dark energy, something older than the trees themselves. He was obsessed with it, and there were whispers of his strange rituals, cults meeting in secret, incantations that invoked spirits, and then, one day, he simply vanished. That Whitmore might have summoned something dark, something that stayed within the walls of the house after his disappearance. Sarah suggested that we leave, but something inside me rebelled against the idea. I didn't want to abandon my new home, my new beginning. But as the days went by, the manifestations of the house grew stronger. Only this time, it didn't disappear so easily. It materialized slowly, like fog spilling from the walls, its eyes glowing faintly. It was human but unnatural, and a cold terror gripped my chest as it advanced. It was Elias Whitmore, or at least the ghost of what was once him. I tried to call out for help, but no sound came from my mouth. The air around me grew thick, pressing in on me like a tangible force. The figure reached out a hand, and with each step the room seemed darker, colder. As it touched me, I felt the floor beneath my feet drop away, and I found myself falling into darkness, into a nightmare. The next thing I knew, I woke up in my bed, sweat clinging to my skin, my heart pounding like a drum. The room was empty, silent. Had it all been a dream? I wasn't sure. But as I rose and walked through the house, things felt different. The walls no longer groaned. The air was not suffocating. The whispering had stopped. I thought I might be safe now, but the attic door was open. It had not been open when I went to bed, and as I looked up into the narrow staircase leading to the attic, something caught my eye. a faint flicker of light, a soft glowing from within the shadows. The book, the one I had found earlier, sat on the stairs, now open, its pages turned as if it was waiting for me to read the rest. I couldn't let it go. Something deep inside me compelled me forward. I approached the attic, the wooden stairs creaking underfoot. The light grew brighter as I ascended until it filled the room with an eerie pale glow. And then I saw the truth. In front of me, the spirit of Elias Whitmore stood, more defined than before, the terror in his eyes sharp and accusing. He did not speak. His presence was his warning. I knew then that I could never escape. The house was not just a home, it was a trap, an anchor for Elias's dark obsession, and now it had claimed me. The figure began to move toward me slowly. Each step carried the weight of decades, of malice and of despair. As it reached out, the walls of the house pulsed, echoing the rhythm of a heartbeat. My breath caught in my throat, and the darkness consumed everything. From that day on, I became another whisper within the house, a part of the unsettling silence that lingered long after the others had left. The house at the edge of the forest, forgotten by time, now held one more secret, a lost soul, bound forever to its creaking walls, and the shadow of Elias Whitmore waited, biding its time, waiting for the next to enter. It was a fresh start for me, a new town, a new job, and most importantly, a new house. The house wasn't grand, but it was everything I had ever wanted, a quiet space, surrounded by trees, and far from the chaos of the city. It was a small 2-bedroom cottage with white walls, a red roof, and a garden that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The real estate agent, Mr. Daniels, had assured me it was a great deal, perfect for someone looking for peace and quiet. He had said with a wide smile. I didn't ask why the price was so low, or why no one had lived there for years. I didn't care. I wanted to start over, and this house seemed like the perfect place to do it. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked a few boxes, made some tea, and sat on the couch, feeling satisfied. The silence was soothing. No honking cars, no neighbors shouting, just the sound of leaves rustling outside. But then, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A faint sound. It wasn't the wind or the creak of old wood. It sounded like whispering. I sat up, straining to hear. It stopped. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of my tired mind. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to tackle the overgrown garden. As I pulled weeds and cleared dead plants, I found something odd, a small rusted key buried in the dirt. It looked ancient. Curious, I took it inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. I didn't think much of it until that evening when I heard the whispers again. This time they were clearer. Words, faint, broken words I couldn't understand. They seemed to come from the walls. I stood frozen, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the room. Nothing. The walls were solid, the house was empty, but the whispers came back. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder. They always started around midnight and lasted for hours. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate. The key I found in the garden seemed to hum with a strange energy whenever I touched it. One evening, while exploring the house, I noticed something odd. A door in the hallway I hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden in the wall, and locked. My heart raced as I retrieved the key. It fit perfectly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A damp, musty smell wafted up, making me gag. I hesitated, but grabbed a flashlight and descended. The basement was cold and empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center of the room. On the floor around it were strange symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, the whispers turned into voices. They were angry, pleading, crying. They echoed through the house, filling every room. "Leave," they said. "Get out." I tried to cover my ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside my head. I ran outside, gasping for air. The cold night was silent, but the house loomed behind me, dark, and menacing. Something was wrong. This wasn't just an old house, it was cursed. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Lights flickered, doors slammed shut on their own, and objects moved. The whispers turned into screams. I tried to contact the real estate agent, but his number was disconnected. Desperate, I searched online for any history about the house. What I found made my blood run cold. Years ago, a man named Henry Calloway had lived there. He was a recluse who practiced dark rituals in the basement. Neighbors reported strange noises and mysterious disappearances. One night, Henry vanished without a trace, and the house was abandoned. The symbols in the basement were part of a summoning ritual. Henry had tried to call something from beyond, and he had succeeded. I knew I had to leave, but it was too late. That night, the house came alive. The walls pulsated, the whispers became deafening, and shadows moved in every corner. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching a knife, praying for dawn. But the house didn't let me go. The door burst open, and a shadowy figure stood there. Its eyes glowed red, and its form shifted like smoke. "Leave!" it roared, its voice shaking the walls. I screamed and ran. The house seemed to twist and change, the hallways stretching and narrowing. I stumbled down the stairs and out the front door, never looking back. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached a motel miles away. The next morning, I returned with the police, but the house was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. No one believed my story. They said the house had burned down years ago, but I know what I saw, what I felt. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it didn't want me there. Even though I was far away, the feeling of dread clung to me like a shadow. My life didn't return to normal. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard faint whispers, like echoes of the house that refused to let me go. I sought help, priests, therapists, even paranormal investigators, but nothing worked. The whispers followed me, growing louder each night. It was as though the house hadn't just been haunted, it had marked me. One evening, I was unpacking some belongings I had hastily taken with me when I found it. The key. It was sitting on the bottom of a box I didn't even remember packing. It looked as ancient and rusted as the day I found it, but now it felt heavier in my hand. Before I could think, a familiar voice whispered in my ear, low and menacing, "You belong to us now." The lights in the room flickered, and the shadows on the walls stretched and twisted. The air turned cold, and the faint scent of decay filled my lungs. I dropped the key and ran, but the walls around me seemed to shimmer, bending and warping like in the house. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. Somehow, impossibly, I was back in the cursed house. The whispers turned into screams as the shadowy figure emerged, its glowing red eyes locking onto me. This time, there was no escape.